You wake with the gradual lightening of the world, not to a sudden jolt, but a slow seep of muted colors into the space around you. The air is heavy, clinging close against your skin like damp linen. You do not open your eyes immediately. Instead, you simply become aware of the shifting weight surrounding you, the rough, woven texture of the pallet beneath your hip, the accumulated warmth slowly leaching away with the hours. The silence of the dwelling at this hour is thick, broken only by noises that sound far off and indistinct. Perhaps it is the soft groan of timbers settling in the cool, damp air, or maybe the first distant clatter of pots from a nearby hearth, muffled by the deep slumber of the surrounding houses. These sounds are not demanding your attention. They are merely establishing the quiet rhythm of the community just beginning to stir. You shift slightly, a minor adjustment that sends a faint rustle across the bedding, and you inhale deeply. The breath tastes clean, cold, carrying hints of wood smoke from last night's banked fires mixed with the sharper, earthy scent of wet soil settling outside your thin window shutters. This coolness feels penetrating, reaching down into the marrow of your bones and seeming to wash away the edges of sleep. Eventually, you must open your eyes fully. The light filtering in is a pale, milky gray, insufficient for casting sharp shadows, but enough to illuminate the fine dust motes suspended lazily in the cool current flowing across the floorboards. You look down at your hands resting beside you. They are slightly stiff from the long night's repose, bearing the residue of yesterday's simple tasks. A faint stain on a nail, perhaps, or the slight ache in a knuckle that reminds you of repetitive labor. Getting up is a slow affair. You allow your muscles to warm gradually, testing each joint with minute movements. The wooden floorboards feel cool and uneven beneath your bare feet as you finally rise, reminding you immediately of the cold seep rising from the unheated earth below them. A layer of grime, mixed perhaps with morning dew, coats the stone threshold near the door, making you tread carefully. The initial journey through your own small home is an exercise in quiet observation. You notice the way the weak light catches on the uneven plaster walls, revealing minute cracks and patches left by time's slow hands. You observe the hearth at the end of the room. It is dark now, smelling faintly of old ash and lingering smoke. The embers have cooled down to a gentle, manageable warmth, banked beneath a shallow layer of soot. You move towards the small opening that serves as your main exit. Here, the cold intensifies noticeably. You pause for a moment, taking another deep breath. The mingling scents are complex. Damp moss from the alleyway, faint animal waste, mixed with the sweet, vegetal promise of life. The cool mist hangs close to the ground, seeming to soften the edges of the stones and the architecture alike. Stepping out onto the narrow path that borders your yard feels like entering a different dimension. The air here has absorbed the temperature of the open field, making it significantly colder than inside the protected walls. You see other people already beginning their day in the distance. A figure moving with purpose towards the central well, another carrying a bundle wrapped tightly against their chest. Their motions are economical, unhurried by unnecessary energy, dictated purely by necessity. You proceed slowly, letting your eyes adjust to the low visibility. The mist is an active presence, swirling around the ankles of passers-by and clinging to the lower branches of the few trees that edge the village perimeter. It diffuses sound, making every unfamiliar noise seem softer, more distant, as if heard underwater. You pass by stacks of drying firewood outside a neighbor's dwelling. The wood is yellowed with age and dampness, smelling richly of cedar and slow decay. You notice how the fog seems to embrace the piled logs, giving them an almost sculptural quality. It makes them seem less like fuel and more like monuments to the passing seasons. Each step you take on the cobbled ground feels deliberate, cushioning your movements against the slight squelch of moisture underfoot. The wet stone is treacherous in places, demanding a focused attention that slows down the passage of time itself. You consider how much of life's rhythm depends upon these quiet moments, the shift from deep rest to slow wakefulness, marked only by the increasing brightness and the steady drip of condensation. As you walk past the adjoining houses, you observe details about your neighbors' routines. One door is slightly ajar, letting out a thin column of sweet-smelling smoke. Someone has clearly been tending an early fire for cooking. Another window pane is smeared with moisture, reflecting the dull gray light in fractured pieces. These small glimpses into private lives build a tapestry of shared existence. The damp cold eventually begins to settle deeper than mere surface chill. It becomes a kind of meditative state, forcing you to slow your breathing and pay attention to minute details. The moss growing in the mortar between the stones, the slight bend in an ancient oak branch, the perfect ripple pattern on a puddle's surface. You think about the passage of time itself during these misty hours. It is not measured by clocks or grand appointments, but by elemental shifts. How the light moves from gray to pale yellow, how the mist thins over the length of the street, and how your own muscles move from stiffness to readiness for action. The initial quiet wait lifts slightly as you approach the main thoroughfare. The presence of others becomes more pronounced. The faint rhythm of muffled footsteps grows steadier. You feel the collective energy of the community stirring into its slow, predictable day. Your personal wakefulness blends seamlessly into this larger communal awakening, affirming your place within the steady, gentle heart of the village life. It is a profound recognition that simply to be present at dawn in this manner is itself enough sustenance for the hours ahead. The early morning air has a distinct chill, clinging to your clothes like damp muslin. You stand near the threshold of your dwelling, where the wooden boards meet the packed dirt floor. The mist that clung so heavily just an hour ago has begun its slow retreat, pulling back from the ground in wisps like unraveling lace. There is a faint but steady scent here, a mix of wet charcoal and cool, deep earth. You notice how this dampness settles not only on your skin, causing gooseflesh beneath your tunic, but also into the pores of the wood around you, darkening the grain slightly. You feel the weight of simple necessities, a rough bundle of kindling slung over one arm, and perhaps a small knife handle tucked into your belt. The first task of the day demands immediate attention to these humble tools. You walk slowly toward the open yard space, mindful that each step is on uneven ground, a mix of trampled earth, scattered straw, and patches of cold stone. The arrangement of wood for the hearth is not merely a chore, it is an act of careful preparation. The kindling you carry needs to be sorted. You kneel down, finding an empty corner patch near the dwelling's outer wall, where the ground settles into a slight dip. You begin to gather the smaller sticks, the split ends, the pencil-thick kindlings that will catch the spark first. Running your fingers along the wood, you feel the varied textures. Some pieces are smooth and water-worn from proximity to ditches. Others are rough and splintery, their bark still attached like dry leather. There is a quiet rhythm in this sorting process. You pick up one piece, turning it over slightly in your palm. It is perhaps chestnut wood. You notice the pale, uniform color of its interior, contrasting sharply with the dark, flaky remnants of the outer rind. You assess its dryness by giving it a gentle tug. If it resists slightly, it will burn cleanly. If it feels brittle and too light, it will merely shatter into wasteful splinters. This methodical arrangement takes time. It requires you to bend at your waist repeatedly, the movement slow and controlled. Each piece of wood placed in its proper spot, a small pile for kindling, a larger stack meant for lasting warmth, is an observation in itself. You consider how gravity will eventually pull these stacks down if they are not held with intention and careful spacing. A single careless action could bring the whole structure down, making the task feel like an exercise in physical engineering. You shift your attention to a corner pile of gathered kindling. Here, several pieces bear the faint reddish stain of soot from last night's banked fire, a reminder of the warmth that was and the work that must continue. You lift a handful of these small sticks, watching how the flakes of ash drift down around your ankles, settling back into the dry dirt. The smell of spent smoke is distinct, mixing with the sharp, clean tang of the damp morning air, a smell associated not with waste, but with potential heat. Next, you approach the tools hanging on a wooden rack near the yard edge. Your hands automatically go to your small sharpening stone and your blade. The metal feels cool beneath your fingertips, colder than the wood, yet promising warmth through friction. You lift the blade, noting its balance and weight. It is a simple piece of craftsmanship, honed only enough to serve its purpose well. The act of sharpening begins in silence. You hold the blade against the stone, drawing it back and forth with steady, moderate pressure. The sound is incredibly intimate, a soft, rhythmic shick-shick-shick. It is not loud, but it occupies the immediate quiet space. With each pass, you feel a minute change on the metal, a subtle straightening of an edge, a sharpening that goes beyond mere superficial care. You watch the fine dust rise from the stone and blade. It is a gray powder, almost invisible until illuminated by the thin, emerging sunlight. As you continue this repetitive motion, your mind begins to slow down, following the steady rhythm of the scraping stone. The necessity of preparation permeates everything. It is not simply that wood must be collected or metal sharpened. These actions are deeply tied to the concept of community sustenance and predictable routine. If the tools dull, the day's craft suffers. If the fire dies prematurely, the warmth departs too quickly. There is a quiet satisfaction in this maintenance. The meticulous care you take with these simple objects mirrors a larger understanding of life itself, that nothing remains perfect forever. Everything requires steady attention to persist. You pause for a moment after sharpening, wiping any remaining grit from the blade's edge with your thumb, testing the newly keen resistance. The knife feels lighter now, more effective. You turn your gaze past the immediate yard to observe the surrounding architecture of the village. The houses are built of timber and wattle and daub, low and hunkering down against the rising mist. You notice the way that light, that pale, watery yellow, begins to creep into the narrow alleyways between the buildings. It highlights the uneven textures, the moss growing in the joints where stone meets wood, the faint smear of mud dried hard on a doorstep. The village is stirring now, but it does so with extreme discretion. You hear not shouts or urgent calls, but the deeper, more foundational sounds of waking life. The occasional clink of earthenware being set down. The low bleating that seems to drift from another yard. Perhaps the distant rumble of an early cart wheel turning on cobblestone. These sounds are signals of necessary motion. They suggest that others are also engaged in their preparations, each person moving with a specific, unhurried purpose related to survival and contribution. You find yourself observing these routines almost academically, the predictable arc of effort that defines communal existence. There is no great rush, only an accumulation of small tasks performed diligently. Stepping further out into the open space near your dwelling, you collect the last few pieces of dry kindling, stacking them neatly against the hearth's stone base. The act of lifting and placing these last sticks feels like drawing a closing curtain on the quietude of dawn and opening another one onto the day's obligations. You breathe deeply, pulling in that cool, earthy mix of wood smoke and damp soil. It is the smell of labor commencing. The morning demands a steady hand and an observant eye. Every object here, the knife, the wood, the stone, the roof tiles, tells a story not of drama or sudden events, but of enduring use, patient repair, and reliable presence. You carry that quiet awareness with you as you mentally prepare to join the measured flow of life unfolding around you. The air arriving at the bakehouse door is warmer than the yard, carrying a thick, yeasty warmth that clings to your clothing. You step across the threshold and immediately feel enveloped by the comforting scent of milling flour and spent grain. This smell is the smell of routine, the inescapable aroma of survival in this part of the year. There are other people already at work. Their movements are practiced and quiet. They move with a deep economy of motion that suggests these tasks are simply extensions of who they are, as natural as breathing or blinking. You take your assigned place, perhaps near the large wooden bins where the remaining grain sits piled high. You begin by simply observing the process before you touch anything. The flour, fine and pale white, rests in mountains and spills over edges with a beautiful, powdery grace. It is not just an ingredient. It seems to hold the promise of sustenance, the potential energy waiting for heat to release its gentle warmth into something solid. One man works near a massive stone rotary quern. Its steady grinding, a low, predictable thrumming sound that vibrates through the packed earth floor and up through your worn leather boots. The dust created by this process is different from the fine flour. It is grit mixed with dry husk, smelling sharply of sun-baked wheat and effort. You watch his forearms, veined and strong, as they rotate the wheel. His concentration seems total, lost in the rhythm of converting hard grain into usable powder. It is a beautiful display of focused persistence. Your task today involves sorting or perhaps assisting with the disposal of spent material. You move among piles of husk and leftover flour dust. The sensation of these grains under your fingers is remarkably delicate. They shift and slide, possessing a light weight that belies their collective nutritional value. You brush away some smaller pieces, noticing how easily the waste accumulates. It settles into mounds next to barrels that are already filled with something else, a darker, stickier residue, perhaps buttermilk or fermentation runoff. As you work through this spent material, you find yourself noticing patterns in the refuse. The discarded husks often have a similar texture and shade of ochre, suggesting they came from the same field, under the same patient sky. It is an immediate visual history embedded in the mundane waste. You pause briefly, kneeling near one such pile, to simply look at the interplay of light across the spilled white flour against the darker brown residue. The air here is a tapestry woven from distinct scents, the sweetness of yeast working its magic, the sharp, slightly acrid tang of burnt char from some earlier bake, and underneath it all, the grounding smell of milled starches. These smells are not unpleasant. They are purely informative, telling you exactly what life, labor, and basic chemistry feel like in this specific time and place. You lift a handful of grain waste, letting the mixture sift through your fingers. It feels strangely comforting, this residue. It is the byproduct of creation, the things left over after something vital has been taken from it. You wonder about the cyclical nature of these processes, how what is discarded here will nourish life somewhere else. The baker next to you wipes his hands on a linen cloth that seems permanently dusted white. He catches your eye for a brief second, and there is no judgment in his gaze, only the shared acknowledgement of labor. You continue gathering, slowly transferring the sorted material into heavy woven sacks meant for later collection. The simple action requires patience, a steady willingness to focus on small quantities. When you are done with this specific pile, your hands feel dusted and faintly stained by various residues. You stand up, feeling the slight ache of repetitive bending in your knees, a gentle reminder that all sustenance comes with physical cost. You turn slowly, looking out from the bakehouse opening toward the sunlit street, where life continues to bubble slightly at an unhurried pace. The sense of quiet industry remains strong. Every motion here is directed, measured, and vital for the continuity of the community. The smell clinging to you, the mix of flour dust and spent grain, becomes a signature scent of this morning's work, linking your body temporarily to the central function of keeping the village fed. You walk out into the cooler air, carrying the residual warmth and the gentle wisdom of the communal effort with you, preparing for what the rest of the day will bring. You walk slowly, the mist still clinging low to the ground, making everything a shade softer and less defined than it ought to be. The air feels cool, carrying with it the mingling scents of wet stone and distant wood smoke. Your boots find purchase on the uneven cobblestones that have worn smooth over centuries of passing feet and cartwheels. You are passing through the heart of the settlement now, leaving the immediate, enclosed quiet of your home for the semi-open thoroughfare. The mist encourages a kind of hush, a momentary slowing of the frantic energy that usually defines waking life. People move with an instinctual grace. Some are already bent over baskets or goods piled high, adjusting their weight as they walk. Others stroll in small clusters, heads slightly bowed against the lingering chill. You observe how the diffused light catches the weave of passing tunics and outer wraps, making the muted browns and grays almost spectral. You notice the rhythm of movement here. It is not a hurry, but rather an accumulation of gentle purposefulness. The clank of a wooden yoke dragging behind a pair of oxen resonates softly in the damp air, followed shortly by the rhythmic thud of leather shoes tapping against stone. Each sound adds a thread to the quiet tapestry of the morning. The passage feels like moving through memory itself, where every archway and corner seems steeped in the routines of those who walked here long before you arrived. You walk with intention, but without haste, cataloging the details not just with your eyes, but with your entire awareness. The way droplets hang from the eaves above the merchant stall, reflecting a miniature, distorted world. The patches of stubborn moss growing in the deep seams between the cobblestones. As you draw nearer to the center, where the main paths meet and widen into what will eventually be the square, the sounds become more textured. You can hear the distant, muffled calls, not shouts of trade yet, but low murmurs of good morning, brief greetings that acknowledge presence without demanding attention. These exchanges are quick, almost functional little bursts of social energy. You pass by a small trough near an open doorway, and you notice residue of feed mixed with water and grit. Nearby, goods are already being laid out on wooden tables, baskets woven from reeds, sturdy blocks covered in oiled cloth. The scent begins to shift here, losing some of the damp earthiness for something more specific: milled flour, slightly sour wood smoke, and the faint metallic smell associated with animals. This slow transition through the town core makes you consider the architecture itself. These buildings stand shoulder to shoulder, built from heavy timber and local stone, their upper stories leaning over the narrow passages below, creating a feeling of sheltered intimacy mixed with profound enclosure. You observe the way the sunlight, though still weak, manages to filter between the closely packed roofs, painting stripes of gold onto the rough plaster walls. The cobblestones underfoot are uneven, requiring you to adjust your steps slightly, transferring your weight from heel to toe in a continuous negotiation with the earth. This physical necessity forces an internal slowness, a meditative rhythm that echoes the purpose of the passage itself, a quiet journey toward the collective waking. You come close enough now that you can perceive the specific signs of commerce beginning. A carpenter's discarded offcuts stacked neatly, a basket seller rearranging reeds by color and size. These small acts of preparation speak volumes about the day's expected labor, suggesting a predictable, necessary flow. As you move deeper, there are glimpses of life that seem to operate on an almost different clock than your own. The early laborers who know the rhythms better than anyone. They carry tools and burdens with an effortless familiarity, their movements economical and deeply practiced. You notice a small child trailing behind a parent's skirt, drawn by the curiosity of passing ankles, only to be gently pulled back into the warmth of the group. The passage prepares you for the market square not through dramatic change, but through accumulated sensation. The quiet hum builds from whispers to murmurs. The scent shifts from raw earth to mingled smells of wood and possibility. You are walking through the very circulatory system of your community, an opening artery leading into a heart that is only just beginning to beat. The architecture frames this passage beautifully. High wooden beams jut out, supporting signs of history, weather-beaten brackets holding up decades of painted notices or simple carvings. Everything here speaks of endurance, wood warped by rain and heat, stone polished by generations of boots, fabrics patched and repaired many times over. You slow your pace further as the buildings give way to a slightly more open area in the distance, the undeniable promise of the market square. You can see clusters of goods being assembled already. Large sacks waiting for grain, crates stacked high with root vegetables, empty wooden barrels placed strategically near building corners. These details solidify the transition from passage to gathering place. There is a deep sense of continuity in the way life continues despite the inherent unevenness and physical strain suggested by the architecture. People are interdependent. The baker needs the woodcutter, the seller needs the grain, all woven together by the necessity of this central open space. You absorb these quiet connections, feeling the steady pull toward the center, a gentle expectation settling into your movements. The weight of the morning mist lifts slowly, thinning out to reveal the full breadth of the square beyond. The light seems suddenly clearer, more direct, yet still possessing a milky quality that promises warmth without revealing excess brilliance. Your quiet passage ends at the edge of the open space, positioning you perfectly between the sheltered paths and the inevitable, structured chaos of commerce. You settle yourself at the rough wooden bench. The surface is cool beneath your palms, bearing the faint polish of countless hands before yours. There are ingrained grooves and shallow scratches here that tell tales of work done over many seasons. You run your fingers across them, feeling the history embedded in the wood grain. The air around the trade bench holds a distinct scent, a mix of cured hide, damp wool, and the sweetish tang of linseed oil. It is the concentrated smell of careful human making, an aroma that speaks of transformation and patience. You adjust your posture, settling into the familiar rhythm of the day's task. You might be mending cloth here, or perhaps working with leather, using simple tools that require precision rather than brute force. The movement becomes a deeply internalized conversation between your hand and the material before you. If you are mending wool, you feel the satisfying give of the thick yarn under the needle. It is not merely an action. It is a meditation on continuity. Each pass of the thread is a commitment to making something whole again, reinforcing the integrity of what was damaged by time or accident. The light in this workshop catches the tiny imperfections, the slight warping of the bench, the way dust motes drift lazily in the narrow shafts of daylight penetrating the oiled parchment window. You notice how the illumination shifts as the slow passage of time marks its presence on the floorboards. There is a methodical quality to this labor that grounds you. Your eyes do not wander toward the market square beyond the bench. They remain focused, tracing the lines and patterns inherent in the material itself. You observe the tension required in your wrist, the gentle push and pull needed to guide the needle through tightly woven fibers. The steady scraping sound of your tool against its surface becomes a kind of internal metronome, setting a calm, reliable pace for your breathing. It is a noise that does not demand attention, but simply exists, underpinning the quiet hum of collective industry. You lift your head briefly to draw in a deeper breath, letting the cool morning air, mixed now with the warmth radiating from neighboring tradesmen, settle deep into your chest. The surrounding sounds are whispers, the gentle tap-tap-taps of another artisan sharpening bone tools nearby, the distant clatter of cart wheels pulling away toward the outer town limits. You feel the ache in your shoulders beginning to build, the satisfying fatigue that comes from focused, deliberate physical effort. This is not pain, but an occupation of the body, a deep knowledge of its function. You pause momentarily, resting the weight of your forearm on the bench edge, allowing your muscles a brief recovery before continuing the meticulous work. Looking out through the open side aperture, you observe the town in reverse motion. The grand bustle of day has not yet arrived, but neither has true morning mist lingered. The air is settling into a persistent state of industrious calm. You consider the sheer volume of human activity that converges upon this small stretch of wood and stone, the convergence of need, skill, and simple survival. Every scrap of thread you pass, every nick in the hide you repair, represents time saved or comfort restored. This quiet process is a fundamental pillar supporting the community's daily routine. The texture of the material beneath your fingers becomes intensely focused upon. If it is leather, you might trace the way the tanning process has altered its molecular structure, making it resilient yet yielding. You feel the coolness of the substance against your skin, and remember that much of what passes through your hands, the goods, the materials, has undergone a slow, necessary chemical change. This deep engagement with the material encourages a quiet reflection on value. Value here is not measured by shiny coin or elaborate adornment, but by utility, by endurance. The object must serve its purpose reliably for many seasons to come. You resume your work with renewed focus. The rhythm returns, predictable and comforting. Your thoughts drift occasionally, unfixed, allowing the current task to guide them like a slow river guiding driftwood. You might contemplate the weather patterns that shaped the local crops or the simple geometry of the roof lines pressing down upon you. The passage of time in this bench is wonderfully imprecise. The sun does not so much move across the sky as it gently brightens the palette of objects around you, deepening the ochre tones and softening the edges of the rough-hewn stalls. You are keenly aware of your own breathing, the steady, rhythmic pull of breath that coordinates itself with the repetition of your actions. It becomes a silent contribution to the atmosphere, another pulse in the collective heart of labor. Occasionally, a small gesture breaks the pattern, perhaps an older neighbor passing by and giving a knowing glance, acknowledging the shared effort. Or maybe a slight gust of wind shifts some scraps of discarded lint on the floor, momentarily distracting your peripheral vision with its lightness. You simply return to your bench, letting the ingrained habits of your hands guide you back into the necessary concentration. The world outside the immediate circle of your trade diminishes in importance. Only the connection between hand and material matters right now. The quiet hum continues, a symphony of soft friction and careful intent. You learn to exist fully within this small sphere of purposeful activity, a microcosm of civilization built on thread, stitch, or polished surface. This deep immersion is where you feel most connected, anchored by the tangible presence of the task before you. The midday sun, though softened by the dust kicked up from the thoroughfare, settles upon you, warming the simple wooden bench where you sit. It is a moment of necessary pause after the rhythmic movements of your morning tasks, a brief suspension in the continuity of labor. You are enveloped by a quiet warmth that contrasts with the cool dampness still lingering near the eaves of the nearby buildings. There is a scent here that defines this hour, a mingling of wood smoke settling from the hearths, the faint sour sweetness of cooling dairy, and the sharp, yeasty promise of remaining bread. You settle your weight onto the worn planks of the bench, feeling the slight give beneath you, an indication of decades of similar gatherings. The low wooden bowls arranged before you suggest a meal meant for sharing, simple sustenance, gathered from sufficiency rather than surplus. Before you are thick slices of day-old bread, still holding some elasticity to bite into, and several round portions of pale cheese, dusted lightly with the grit from your hands or perhaps from the natural stone used in its aging. Beside these roots of nourishment rests a stoneware jug containing ale, cooled somewhat by the time it reached your gathering spot. You lift a thick piece of bread, noting the deep scoring marks that crisscross its crust, evidence of the baking process, and the skill of the bakehouse hands who worked before you arrived. Its texture seems robust, designed to endure the rigors of travel and the weight of a day's meal. As you tear a manageable chunk away from the loaf, the sound is minimal, a soft, yielding rip that seems swallowed by the general background murmur of village life. This simple act requires no preparation, only an intention towards sustaining life. You notice how others nearby approach their own meager portions. There is no display of wealth or excess. Everything present speaks of careful management and necessary routine. A neighbor scoops a measure of cheese onto a piece of flat wood, the pale substance yielding slightly under his touch. You watch the subtle movements of hands that know precisely what they are doing, hands hardened by repetition, accustomed to handling grains, fibers, and stone. The ale is poured gently into small wooden tankards. The liquid catches the muted sunlight, reflecting back a dim golden light. You take your first sip, feeling the cool, slightly bitter warmth slide down your throat. It does not taste of luxury, but of necessity. It is refreshing after hours spent in warm enclosure and manual effort. You breathe out slowly through your nostrils, releasing a breath that carries only the faintest hint of wood smoke and earth. Eating here, gathered amid the steady, low-thrumming sounds of voices and occasional murmurs, requires an almost silent rhythm. You observe how people eat without undue haste. They break bread in small pieces, saving the best crumbs for later, as if conserving not just calories, but moments of simple pleasure. There is a quiet economy to every gesture, the careful scraping of cheese onto grain, the methodical chewing that accompanies the reflective pause. Your gaze drifts past your immediate meal, taking in the way the midday light illuminates the rough texture of the surrounding stone buildings and wooden stalls. The architecture itself seems to breathe with the rhythm of passing lives. The beams are aged dark brown, stained by centuries of smoke and rain. The plaster on the walls holds the patina of countless touches. While chewing slowly, savoring the contrast between the dense bread and the mild saltiness of the cheese, you begin to contemplate sufficiency. This simple meal contains everything needed for the body's immediate continuation: energy from the carbohydrates, fat and protein from the dairy. There is a profound quietness in this understanding that life can be sustained by such foundational elements. It suggests a rhythm where need dictates action, and plenty is measured not by accumulation, but by steady provision. You notice a small stream of runoff water trickling down the stone path nearby, pooling momentarily before finding its way into the earth. You watch how quickly the dust and fallen leaves absorb the moisture, creating momentary dark patches against the paler stones. This natural cycle, the fall of water, the drink of earth, feels deeply connected to the lesson of this meal. That sustenance is always flowing, circulating, found in simple connections. The conversation around you ebbs and flows like the tide out of a slow river. It is not marked by dramatic declarations or great anxieties, but by practical observations. Which fields will dry first, when the rain might return? How strong the current thread needs to be for mending nets? These are conversations rooted entirely in immediate reality, in the deep knowledge of the landscape and the season. You trace the pattern of a slight burn mark on the wooden bench beside you, a dark scar against the paler wood. It is evidence of discarded heat, of necessary transformation, the baking bread, the burning fire. These objects, both physical and abstract, bear witness to life's continuous exchange of energy and materials. As your stomach feels settled, a gentle, deep-seated fullness replaces the emptiness of the early morning. You finish the last remnants of cheese and bread with slow, deliberate movements. The meal is done, but the pause lingers. It is a quiet contemplation on limits, the limits of the available ingredients, the limits of time for rest, and perhaps the limit of human complaint. Your energy feels reset, weighted gently by the nourishment taken. This necessary stillness prompts a reflection on the meaning of deep satisfaction. It does not arrive with sudden fanfare or dramatic events. Rather, it settles slowly, like dust settling into corners, when the body is properly fed and the mind has paused long enough to observe its own quiet continuity. You feel your awareness shift from the immediate demands of eating to the broader rhythm of existence. A slow breath in, a measured pace out. The temporary grounding provided by this simple meal makes the eventual observations of other aspects of village life seem even more stable, more fundamentally real. The warmth remains, anchored within you, a quiet readiness for whatever task the afternoon brings, acknowledging that today's continuity is built upon yesterday's humble roots, and tomorrow's shared necessity. The weight of the late afternoon sun settles over the edge of town, not with a sudden brilliance, but with a slow, honeyed warmth. You turn your steps away from the central cluster of shops and the fading bustle of people, following a winding track toward the market pens that sit just outside the main residential area. The transition is gradual. You do not leave the human scent entirely behind, but rather filter it through the stronger, richer aromas of the outer world. You notice how the light changes as you pass under an awning. The bright yellow afternoon glare softens into something more diffused and golden on your skin. You walk slowly now, deliberately unhurried, letting the pace match the gentle slope of the ground beneath your worn boots. The path is uneven earth mixed with compacted gravel, warmer to the touch than the damp stones you walked hours earlier. As you approach the penned area, a new medley of smells rises: the sharp tang of manure, the sweet decay of dung mixed with hay, and undercutting it all, the distinct earthy musk of many breathing bodies. The noise is not harsh. Rather, it is a continuous background hum of low grunting, occasional squealing, and the soft crunching of hooves on dry ground. You slow your breath to match this rhythm, adopting an observer's quiet stillness. This area feels different from the town itself. Here, life is exposed in its rawest, most basic state. You arrive at the pens. They are simple constructions of rough-hewn timbers and thick ropes, enclosing various creatures that are meant for utility. Cattle chew methodically near a trough, their breath steamy even in the mild warmth. A few geese paddle noisily in a muddy runoff pit nearby, kicking up small puffs of brown sludge. But your attention settles upon the pigs. They occupy a large, relatively open pen at the far corner. There is nothing particularly dramatic about them. They simply exist, rooting and wallowing in the dry dirt floor that has accumulated over days. Several are curled into lazy heaps, their coarse hair dusted with the ochre color of the earth. You observe one pig specifically. It lies slightly apart from the others, near a patch of trampled straw. Its snout is resting on an upward mound of soil, and it makes a small, almost imperceptible puffing sound with its nose, a gentle expulsion of air that settles back into the quiet clatter of the pen. This action seems entirely focused, utterly contained in itself. You pause, letting your eyes drift over the group. They are animals of simple, profound contentment, moving only when necessary and feeding without apparent concern for human judgment or polite society. Their existence seems governed by immediate need. The next patch of dirt to explore, the next scrap to root up, the next source of cool mud for relief. You watch a small cluster of pigs interacting. One pig, particularly glossy brown, manages to push itself upright with surprising agility, only to immediately drop back down into the soft bedding. Another companion approaches this first pig, not aggressively, but with a kind of gentle, sniffing curiosity. The interaction is entirely unscripted and profoundly natural. There are no elaborate bows or formal gestures. There is simply an acknowledgement that another being occupies the same patch of dirt. It brings a strange sense of peace to your mind. You consider the difference between this casual coexistence and the more complex, sometimes fraught interactions you have witnessed within the town. The subtle stiffness in greetings, the necessity of maintaining public appearances even when exhausted. Here, with the animals, there is no performance required. You feel the dust settle on your clothes, fine powder mingling with the residual scent of smoke clinging to your woven tunic. You notice that the light hitting their flanks is intensely golden, catching the slightest ripple of muscle or the coarse bristles around their muzzles. It seems as if the afternoon sun has been filtered specifically for this moment, making everything slightly more vivid and strangely peaceful. As you stand there, simply watching them root at the earth's surface, a thought settles gently in your chest. Perhaps these creatures possess a form of living wisdom that humans often complicate or overlook. They move through their routine tasks, feeding, sleeping, investigating, with an impressive lack of internal monologue, with every action having immediate utility and perfect focus. You shift slightly, the slight scraping sound under your boot sounding surprisingly loud in the afternoon air. You realize you have been observing for quite some time, letting the rhythms of the pigs become a sort of meditative metronome for your own heart. The quietude they embody is not the silence of absence, but the rich presence of simple being. It is an existence predicated on cycles, eating, sleeping, wallowing, waiting for the next resource. There is no striving against external expectations. There is only adherence to the gentle push and pull of natural necessity. You gather your thoughts slowly, the reflections drifting like specks of dust caught in a sunbeam. This observation of simple rhythm feels remarkably restorative. The constant effort of navigating human routine, the need for politeness, the expectation of wit, the careful management of status, feels suddenly exhausting when contrasted with the pig's unburdened afternoon repose. You give one final, gentle glance to the animals. They are simply occupying space and living in the warm, fading light, accepting the earth beneath them without question or reservation. The weight that had been resting on your shoulders, a subtle pressure of human expectation, seems to lift just a fraction more, replaced by this earthy, undeniable calm. Turning away from the pens, you walk back slowly along the dusty path. The sensory shift is noticeable. The rich, animal scents begin to dilute, mixing again with the fainter notes of wood smoke and distant baking bread. You feel calmer than when you arrived, carrying the steady, simple rhythm of the pig's afternoon rest within your memory. A quiet antidote to the complexities awaiting you as the sun finally begins its descent toward the western hills. You settle onto the low wooden bench, finding a spot in the quiet corner near the old weaver's hut. The light here is softer than the open square, filtered through the eaves of the nearby buildings. You sit close enough to hear the steady, measured breathing beside you, the rhythm of an age lived slowly, deliberately. An older man sits with his hands folded in his lap, watching nothing and everything at once. He does not need to speak to pass knowledge. The way he holds himself, the subtle tilt of his head when listening to a passing sound, speaks volumes. You notice the deep creases etched around his knuckles, lines that map decades of labor, the precise texture of them like dry riverbeds upon wrinkled earth. They tell tales of tools used and lives lived under similar autumn skies. You observe the way the dust motes hang suspended in the shafts of sunlight that pierce through the roof gap overhead. Each particle seems to be holding its own quiet history, catching the light momentarily before drifting down again. The air here smells faintly of aged wood and dried lavender, a scent blending time and patience. You are acutely aware of the stillness, a heavy, comforting blanket woven from silence and routine. The man occasionally shifts his gaze towards the small courtyard fountain, where the water drips with a gentle, irregular rhythm. Each drop seems to be falling not just through gravity, but through accumulated years, echoing softly against the worn stone basin. You watch how he watches the water. It is an intensely focused observation, considering nothing grand or dramatic about the simple action. It is merely the pattern of existence, the inevitable meeting of 2 points that results in a sound. You find yourself paying attention to his hands again, noticing how they rest upon the bench. They are large and capable, but also rested. There is a gentle weariness there, too, not a dramatic ache, but the deep, settled fatigue of accumulated routine. He lifts one hand slowly, observing its movement as if it were an object alien to him. The skin is tanned and crisscrossed with subtle scars, marks acquired from forgotten tasks or accidental encounters with rough materials. You feel a quiet pull, a desire not for stories, which can often be theatrical and exaggerated, but for the simple mechanisms of memory, the pure mechanics of knowing how things were done. The conversation does not begin immediately. Instead, there is a period of mutual observation, a slow acclimatization to shared silence. You notice him adjusting his posture slightly. He shifts the weight on one hip, causing the worn fabric of his breeches to settle around his ankles with a faint rustle. It is such a small, entirely human detail that grounds you further in this moment. You observe how the neighboring market stall holder sweeps the dirt from the cobblestones. A steady, monotonous shhh sound accompanying the rising dust. This rhythmic action acts like a gentle metronome for your internal sense of time. Life here moves to the pace of necessity, sweeping, breathing, working, eating, resting. It is never dramatic, it is merely persistent. You wonder about the nature of knowledge itself. Is it best stored in grand pronouncements and fiery telling, or is it found instead in the quiet movements that are repeated until they become second nature? You contemplate the wisdom you seek, not a clever trick or a sudden revelation, but the ingrained rhythm of someone who has simply shown up every day for decades. The kind of knowledge that speaks through muscle memory. The man then gently reaches into a pouch at his waist and pulls out a small sliver of polished bone. It might have been part of a tool handle long ago. He turns it over in the light, watching how the curved surface catches the sun's passing glow. His thumb traces a groove across its length, a gesture so utterly mundane yet imbued with immense weight. You recognize that simple object not because he tells you its history, but because of the way his fingers interact with it, the practiced ease, the familiarity suggesting generations of handling similar things. You decide to follow this rhythm of observation. Rather than asking a direct question about the past, you simply watch the continuity in his movements. You see how his gaze moves from the bone back out toward the courtyard fountain, then to the edge of the dusty path where a stray cat is carefully inspecting some bits of discarded grain. Everything seems connected by this thread of simple, persistent observation. The learning here feels like osmosis. It is soaking in through your skin and into your bones. You are absorbing not facts, but approaches. The steady gaze, the unhurried placement of an object, the acknowledgement that routine itself contains deep meaning. This contrasts sharply with the expectation of quick answers or dramatic advice. You consider the contrast between the vivid stories often told in taverns, full of exaggerated drama and sweeping historical arcs, and this quiet afternoon lesson. Here, the truth seems heavier, less easily spoken, anchored instead to the permanence of the sun beating down on the same cobblestones and the persistent dripping into that stone basin. The simple act of waiting, of sitting still in a shared space while another person simply exists with practiced ease, becomes its own profound lesson. You realize that true expertise is not about what you know, but how gracefully you continue to engage with the simplest elements of your day-to-day existence. The way he breathes out, slow and steady, the slight flex of his ankle as he adjusts his seat, the comfortable weight of silence, these are the master lessons. The late afternoon sun begins its slow, inevitable descent, pulling the shadows into long, stretching forms across the packed earth of the thoroughfare. You notice how these lengthening shapes change the quality of the light entirely. It is less the bright, demanding glare of midday, and more something honeyed, diffused, catching dust motes, suspended in the still air. The air itself carries a shifting complexity of smells, the fading sharpness of wood smoke from the hearths that were recently tended, mingled now with the damp, earthy scent rising up from the shaded corners, where the cobbled paths meet the dirt tracks. You feel the slight cooling against your exposed skin, a gentle reminder that the warmth of the day is drawing inward, preparing for the quiet enclosure of evening. You start by gathering what needs tending before the true dark settles in. Perhaps it is the small communal drying rack near the wall, upon which linen and herbs are strung to dry. You lift a length of coarse flax cloth, feeling its rough, slightly scratchy texture against your fingertips. You pause, observing how the fading light filters through the hanging strands, illuminating the minor imperfections, a pulled thread here, a slight stain there, that speak to the use and care given over many seasons. A little further along, near the trough where water has been drawn for the day's needs, you bend down. The stone feels cool even after hours of baking sun. You run your hand along the moss-flecked edges of the basin. Its coolness is a sharp counterpoint to the mild, lingering warmth in your palms, drawing attention to the persistent presence of life and decay side by side. This necessity of using and restoring things seems to be the quiet rhythm that governs the entire community. Everything requires constant, gentle intervention. The shadows lengthen further, urging you toward other necessary tasks. Perhaps it is fetching firewood that was left too scattered or collecting gathered refuse from the edges of the settlement. You walk with an unhurried gait, your attention drawn to small details beneath your feet. A knobbly root sticking out of the dirt floor, a handful of dried berries clinging to low brush. These tiny elements are anchors in the passing time, giving shape to moments that otherwise might feel formless and boundless. You find yourself near the open yard, where kindling is stacked for the evening fires. The wood smells dry and resinous, a smell that speaks of slow burning and lasting warmth against the impending coolness. You spend time stacking the smaller pieces meticulously, ensuring that no gap remains unfilled, making sure the foundation for tomorrow's comfort is stable. Each small movement, lifting a splintered stick, placing it perfectly parallel to another, becomes a meditation on pattern and placement. As you move through these necessary chores, your gaze drifts often to the edges of the settlement. You see people engaged in their own simple preparations. A woman drawing water with an old wooden bucket, her movements practiced and economical. Two men sitting near an open window, seemingly mending fishing nets with thick threads, all of them working within the quiet architecture of routine. There is no sense of urgency among them, only a steady engagement with the immediate task at hand. Later, you might find yourself tasked with gathering something specific, perhaps kindling from a managed woodlot or collecting stray goods that need organizing. The process demands slow observation. You learn to see the difference between debris and usable material, distinguishing the brittle, useless husk of last year's harvest from a thick vine that will burn well, or identifying pieces of driftwood washed up that might serve as structural supports for a meager fence. The weight of the gathering seems profound in its simplicity. It is not merely an accumulation of materials, but a collection of preparations of warmth, preparation against the night's damp chill, and preparation for the continuous cycle of the following day. You notice how everything here is built to endure time and weather, designed by hands that knew the meaning of necessity deep in their bones. The smells become more pronounced as the sun dips, the mineral scent of wet stone mixing with the growing, faint sweetness of wood smoke carried on a breeze. You follow this subtle aroma back towards your own dwelling, drawing you inward from the communal rhythm to the quiet safety of your own threshold. You stop briefly at the edge of your property line, looking back across the cooling town. The shapes of the roofs look heavier now, cast in deep purple and slate tones against the darkening sky. The sounds begin to change too. The clatter of buckets and tools fades, replaced by a more muffled tapestry of existence. The distant, rhythmic sighing of an animal settling for the night, the low murmur of voices that are no longer discussing urgent matters, but merely sharing the day's simple continuity. The gentle creak as the last person crosses the threshold. The whole experience becomes one of managed deceleration. You slow your breath to match the cooling rhythm of the air, accepting the transition from the noisy complexity of daytime work to the quiet containment of the evening hours. The labor done today, the firewood stacked, the water drawn, the nets repaired, provides a deep, settled peace. It is the satisfying ache of useful exhaustion, a physical anchor connecting you firmly to this place and its necessary rhythms. You feel yourself sinking deeper into the communal routine, ready to let the outer world's activity fold away until the morning light demands attention once more. The slow descent towards night carries with it a profound sense of belonging, woven into the very structure of simple, shared labor. The last sounds of the day begin to settle around you. It is not a sudden quiet, but a gradual quieting, as if the village itself is taking a long, slow breath. You feel the shift in the air first, the coolness that rises from the wet earth underfoot, carrying with it the mingled scents of wood smoke and damp roots. The cool evening deepens the scent memories, the faint saltiness near the well, mixed with the sharper tang of drying hide and the sweet, earthy smell where the animal manure has been scattered earlier in the day. You move slowly, deliberately, letting your eyes adjust to the deepening hues of twilight. The light filtering through the narrow streets is a muted thing, stained with violet and deep slate gray. Each passing building side seems to absorb the remaining warmth from the sun, holding it in the thick, cool stone. You are heading back toward the shelter of your own home, taking care not to rush the process. The ground beneath you changes subtly here. The cobblestones that held the heat of the day give way to packed dirt mixed with grit, a surface softer and more yielding under the sole of your shoe. You notice how the rhythm of your footsteps alters slightly, matching the slowing cadence of the world around you. Looking up at the roof lines, you see the smoke stains high on the gables, permanent marks etched by countless days of cooking fires. These signs speak not of fleeting moments, but of deep continuity, the ceaseless cycle of burning wood and returning ember. The main communal sounds have faded now. The far-off clatter that might have been from a wash basin or the muted complaints of livestock are receding into background whispers. You begin to notice the small details in the deepening shadows. A stray, discarded piece of straw near a doorway, the way rainwater has trickled down the slate of an adjacent roof, leaving a darker streak. The simple, unadorned geometry of the wooden doorframe that seems both sturdy and weary with time. You approach the open yard of your dwelling. The air here feels heavier, warmer than the passing streets, cushioned by the residue of night's cool breath mingling with the steady, low warmth emanating from your hearth. You pause near the outer corner, taking a slow breath that fills your chest entirely. This breath seems to cleanse the day's dust and activity from your lungs. Your attention is drawn to the source of water for the evening's needs, perhaps an open barrel or the wellhead. The wooden structure of the barrel is marked by dark lines where centuries of wood smoke have penetrated its grain. You observe the small drip that continues, steadily, rhythmically. It is a gentle plink, plink, sound against the stone lip below. This simple dripping sound becomes unusually pronounced in the settled silence, establishing a perfect, unhurried beat against which you can calibrate your own breathing. Focusing on this single, liquid measurement, the drip, you consider its nature. It is cool water. It has traveled from some source far away, passing through earth and rock, collecting slowly until gravity finally persuaded it to drop. You watch how the small pool of water where the drips land gathers just slightly before dispersing outward, absorbing the minuscule impact. The coolness of the water contrasts sharply with the residual warmth clinging near the hearth stones, the ghost heat of wood smoke that has not quite dissipated. You move toward the low fire pit area. Here, the smell is richest, not merely smoke, but the composite scent of spent embers, cooled ash, and the woody sweetness of burned pine tips. You bend down slightly, inhaling deeply near the edge of the hearth. It is a grounding aroma, reminding you that life here revolves around this simple exchange. The energy given by wood, released as heat, and contained within those cool stones until dawn calls for it anew. Your hands naturally begin to assess what remains. There are logs stacked neatly against the outer wall. Some still hold internal warmth, their surfaces slightly moist from the evening's chill. You run a hand over the rough bark of a piece, noting its flaky texture and the deep fissures that trace paths across the wood grain. The physical weight of the material is comforting, suggesting resilience and the passage of time held solid in timber. As you survey your small domestic space, There is an overwhelming sense of permanence mingled with ephemeral change. The stone walls have endured countless seasons. The simple arrangement of tools and hearth goods speaks to routines practiced across generations. This place feels fixed against the vast, unceasing flow of time outside. The light in the yard is minimal now, requiring you to look closely at textures. You notice tiny pockets of moss growing where dampness collects on the north side of the stone steps. A vibrant, deep green that seems improbably bright in the twilight gloom. This small growth requires constant moisture and a sheltered place, suggesting how life finds purchase even in places deemed otherwise overlooked. You carry yourself with an unhurried grace, each step measured by the diminishing light and the cooling air. The village is settling into its collective quietude, preparing for the deep rest that will recharge it for another day of simple sustenance and work. Thinking about the things people do to survive here, you reflect on the necessary simplicity. Every object has a utility, every breath has a rhythm, and even sleep is an active process of recovery. There is a quiet wisdom in accepting this minimal set of needs: the wood for heat, the water for life, the earth for food. The pervasive coolness now enters your clothes, settling against your skin like a fine mist. It touches your cheeks and settles into the creases of your knees as you wait momentarily near the dwelling threshold. You stand still, letting the temperature adjust your internal rhythm to match the cooling exterior world. The only sounds are the gentle plink from the barrel and the almost inaudible scratch of shifting grit beneath your worn leather shoes. You turn back toward the small accumulation of kindling, small slivers gathered earlier. They hold just enough residual heat to keep the coals banked until you can fully prepare them for sleep, a careful guardianship of precious energy. You think about how this day's labor has culminated in this moment, the turning of wood into usable warmth, and the necessity of conservation. It is this slow settling, the letting go of urgency, the acceptance of the cooling temperature, the deep inhale of smoke and water, that finally settles you into a state of profound, necessary peace. The day's demands are tucked away, replaced by the patient rhythm of nightfall. The evening air has settled over the village, possessing a distinct coolness that sinks into your clothes and settles in your bones. It carries the faint, blended scent of banked embers and wood smoke from all the hearths clustered together down the narrow street. You are inside now, away from the cooling chill of the outer passages, but still acutely aware of the world outside the wattle-and daub walls. The low light filtering through your small window panes seems to be the deepest twilight hue, a soft, bruised mix of slate and violet. You settle yourself into a wooden chair near the threshold, finding a spot that catches the gentle wash of reflected lamplight from the adjacent house. There is no urgency in this moment. Time here moves with the viscosity of thick honey. You are simply present, anchored by the stillness. The sounds around you are not loud events, but rather layers. The soft creak of wood contracting as it cools, the occasional splash of water somewhere distant, and the measured rhythm of quiet breathing from nearby homes. A neighbor, perhaps a close acquaintance or someone whose family has lived in this same patch of earth for generations, finds a similar unoccupied spot. They settle down with an air of comfortable familiarity. The meeting is not marked by grand greetings, but rather by a subtle, shared pause, an acknowledgement that the day's work is done, and the conversation must now proceed at the pace of falling ash. You do not need to speak immediately. You simply observe the quiet choreography of arrival, the way their shawl settles over one shoulder, the slight slump of tired posture, the gentle movement as they finally relax into the wood. This shared silence is itself a form of communication, implying mutual understanding and the weight of communal life. Eventually, words arrive, not in bursts, but like slow drops of water hitting stone, rhythmic, thoughtful, spaced out. The conversation begins with the simplest details: what the weather has done to the crop fields this year, or how the stream level seems altered after the rainfall last week. You listen to the cadence of their voice, noticing the subtle rise and fall that suggests thoughtfulness rather than merely passing talk. The light sources nearby are few and fragile, small, oiled paper lamps, or perhaps just carefully banked tallow candles. They cast an intimate pool of weak, yellowish glow onto your faces and the rough surface of a low table. This low illumination forces you to look closer, noticing minute details, the fine lines around their eyes that speak of countless laughter and worries, the way the dim light catches the dust motes dancing lazily in the smoky air, the faint staining on the wood where generations have rested their elbows. The conversation drifts, as these things often do when guided by weariness and proximity, toward memory. It is not a sudden recounting of dramatic events, but rather a quiet consideration of how life has simply unfolded. The passing seasons, the predictable rhythm of births and small losses, the enduring permanence of the village walls themselves. You find yourself thinking about time not as a clock ticking forward, but as a thick, palpable substance that has accumulated layer upon layer over centuries. You feel a growing thoughtfulness concerning the simple rhythms of daily life, the cycles of labor, rest, meager food, and persistent community connection. Your mind drifts subtly to observations made earlier in the day, perhaps back toward the market square or the edges where the livestock grazed. You think about the sheer unburdened simplicity of those animals, especially pigs. The thought is not stated aloud, but it seems to settle quietly between you, hanging like an unspoken cloud in the cooling air. The neighbor might smile faintly at this association, acknowledging a shared point of contemplation that requires no formal explanation or elaborate speech. Conversations by low light tend to strip away artifice. They peel back the layers of polite necessity until only the core rhythms remain: breath, hunger, rest. When you consider the natural processes, the pig rooting through damp earth without conscious thought, its focus solely on the immediate reward beneath its snout, or how the cattle simply browse in a low arc of unthinking need, a quiet contrast emerges with human concerns. You realize that many of the complexities discussed at this table, concerning proper manners, expected behavior, and social maneuvering, are almost entirely internal constructions. They require tremendous mental energy to maintain, much like keeping up an elaborate ritualistic performance. The weight of these social expectations suddenly feels heavy against the fragile backdrop of the evening calm. You reflect on how much energy is expended simply on being appropriate for a setting, or appearing correct in conversation. The neighbor nods slowly in agreement with your unspoken contemplation. There is a shared understanding that some creatures, the ones who live purely within their immediate sensory environment, do not carry this load. You notice the way they handle their simple objects: the cup of ale, the rough wooden bowl. Their movements are economical and efficient, lacking any superfluous gesture designed merely to impress or perform. It is pure utility mixed with deep comfort. This casual, unself-conscious existence feels deeply restful in comparison to the polished but exhausting performance required by human society. The scent of Woodsmoke seems stronger now, mingling intimately with the coolness. You trace the patterns on a nearby wooden beam, noticing how the grain has been worn smooth over countless hands passing by. This enduring architecture speaks of continuous life, 1,000 small routines stacked upon one another. You let your awareness drift back to the quiet resilience required merely to maintain daily existence. It is not about grand achievements or memorable speeches. It is about showing up, day after day, under varying light and weather, repeating the necessary tasks that keep the community viable. The low light deepens, pulling the conversation further into hushed tones. The details of the village, the slightly crooked roofline, the uneven paving stones, the persistent, steady smoke, all seem to take on a profound sense of quiet dignity. You accept this rhythm, the gentle settling down, the comfortable weariness that allows for true reflection. The world can afford to pause now, suspended, in the rich embrace of approaching night. You finally leave the small confines of your home, stepping out into the cool stillness that settles over the village after the last embers have cooled. The air here is different from the close warmth shared within. It carries a distinct scent, a mingling of wet earth and distant wood smoke, cut through by the sharp, clean tang of the night dew settling on the thatch roofs. You pause at the threshold, letting your eyes adjust to the deep indigo wash of twilight that has deepened into true night. The sounds are hushed now, muted by the sheer weight of darkness. Only the occasional creak of a loose shutter or the soft, rhythmic sighing of wind through the closely packed timber walls breaks the profound quiet. You begin your slow walk away from the clustered warmth of the dwellings. Your path takes you upward, slightly removed from the immediate bustle and complexity of the main village street, toward an open area where life seems to spread out unburdened by stone walls. The feeling is one of expanding space, a release from the constrained architecture that has defined your existence all day. As your feet find purchase on the packed dirt path, you note how different the ground feels compared to the uneven cobblestones of the market square. Here, the earth yields softly beneath you. Ahead, the simple roof lines of the houses settle into permanent silhouettes against the darkening sky. You stop for a moment, simply allowing your breath to regulate itself with the passing cool air. You observe the angle of the surviving buildings, noting how their heavy wooden beams and thickly packed wattle and daub walls seem to absorb the surrounding quiet, holding it close like deep breaths. This architecture has endured seasons upon seasons, summer heat, harsh winter rains, each dwelling a monument to steady human routine. It is a constancy that you have spent your day participating in, from the early rush of fire kindling to the focused repetition of labor at the bench. The physical structure of the village seems inextricably linked to the rhythm of survival itself. The subtle scent changes as you walk further out. The strong smoke and flour give way to the richer, more primal smell of open pastureland, wet grass and animal breath. You reach a low rise, an area where human settlement gives way entirely to agricultural ground. Here, the darkness feels less contained, less defined by man-made edges, allowing the true scale of the night sky to dominate your vision. You lift your gaze slowly, craning your neck back until it feels almost dislocated, and the expanse above meets you. The stars arrive not suddenly, but as a slow seepage of light from nothingness. They are numerous, clustered in impossible formations, scattered with such dazzling indifference across the vault overhead that they make the entire world below seem remarkably small. You trace one pattern with your eye, a faint dusting of stellar diamonds near what you recall being called the plow. The immensity is deeply calming, yet it also holds a certain quiet weight, prompting thought about how little control any single life possesses against such grand cosmic indifference. You contemplate this vast canopy while remaining acutely aware of your immediate surroundings. The feel of the cool night air brushing past your cheeks, carrying minute particles of pollen or dust, the faint, earthy fragrance rising from the damp soil beneath your feet. It is a constant dialogue between the profound emptiness above and the solid ground supporting you below. Before you return to the sheltered existence of the town's heart, there lies a small, open patch of ground, a place where several animals have gathered, perhaps for an early rest before the true cold sets in. You notice the faint tracks pressed into the soft mud, not belonging to boots or wheels, but hooves and paws. The animal life, even now that they are settled, holds a certain effortless grace. They are connected directly to this quiet rhythm of time. Their existence seems governed by hunger, sleep, and simple movement, without the necessity of complex schedule or worry about reputation. Your thoughts naturally drift back to the livestock you observed earlier in the day, particularly the pigs. You remember watching them root through the cool earth, entirely preoccupied with the immediate texture and smell of what lay beneath the surface. They moved with a singular, focused utility, their energy aimed only at satisfying a primal need. There was no visible anxiety about tomorrow's rain or the precise angle of social greeting required when passing a neighbor on the dusty road. The contrast strikes you gently. Your life, woven into the intricate fabric of community obligation and careful routine, requires so much conscious effort. The planning for the next day's work, the polite nods in the street, the measured tone in conversation. The pigs seem to exist simply within the perfection of their current moment. They were masters of unburdened being. You watch a particularly stout sow settle herself into the mud patch, her breathing audible in the stillness. She curls up, entirely at ease, displaying an absolute confidence in her simple rhythm. You observe this perfect state of self-sufficiency and quiet competence, realizing that perhaps the greatest social grace is simply the ability to be content within one's own natural cycle. The reflection does not feel like a critique of your own life, but rather a subtle shift in perspective, a gentle lowering of expectation. When you return toward the village, crossing back over the rougher dirt path and toward the faint glow that signals habitation, the weight that settles on your shoulders seems marginally lighter. The stars remain overhead, vast and indifferent to human failings or successes, while down below, life continues its quiet, necessary pattern. The journey of the evening is marked by a growing sense of peace. You notice how the air here feels cooler than any time during the day's intense heat, pulling a refreshing chill deep into your bones that settles into a state of restful anticipation. You are no longer observing only function and labor. You are observing sleep itself, the deepest form of cessation that precedes and resets the cycle. The simple patterns of life in this settlement, viewed against the immense scatter of distant starlight, begin to harmonize with a sense of profound, deep calm. The necessity of tomorrow's work remains undeniable, but it feels less like an obligation and more like an organic continuation of breath, just as quiet and steady as the pulse under your own jawline. You walk slowly now, absorbing the pervasive hush, the comforting knowledge that tonight, all systems, the stars, the animals, the people in these wooden shells, will simply rest, preparing for the gentle, inevitable rising once more. The cool air seems to have thickened since you left the soft light of your dwelling. You walk slowly, finding a place where the settling dust settles on still surfaces, and let your senses adjust fully to the quiet weight of night. The last echoes of human activity, a distant cough, perhaps, or the muffled clatter of pottery, are already dissolving into the deep hush that blankets the village at rest. You notice the shifting atmosphere. It is not merely quietude, but a profound blanket of near silence. The scent profile of this hour is complex and gentle. It carries the cool minerality of wet earth mixed with the persistent, smoky sweetness left by the day's banked hearth fires. Beneath those notes, You detect the faint, comforting aroma of animal waste, mingled with wood smoke and sleep, a scent wholly characteristic of human settlement when all movement has ceased. You stand for a moment, simply breathing it in, letting the varied smells anchor your physical presence to this place. You turn your attention to the ground beneath your feet. The cobblestones, once scattered with the day's residue, dust motes kicked up by cartwheels, splinters from woodwork, now reflect only the pale wash of the moon, dampening their surfaces and making them slick underfoot. You move carefully, paying attention to how your wooden soles interact with the wet stone, a soft give and slip that seems inconsequential yet deeply rhythmic. This careful movement forces a slowdown, pulling you out of any hurried thought and into pure physical observation. The concept of rest takes on a very different texture tonight than it did when observing your neighbors preparing for sleep earlier. There was an energy to their tiredness then, a final burst before stillness. Now, the silence is more absolute, suggesting not just pausing, but a deep sinking back into a primal rhythm. You wander toward the edge of the village thoroughfare, where the structures thin out and the wilder fields begin. Here, the boundary between human control and natural decay becomes noticeable. You observe how stray bits of discarded wood or cloth are slowly being reclaimed by the grass, the resilient green pushing up through packed soil. It is a quiet, persistent negotiation happening at the very edge of the village's neat order. Earlier, your thoughts had drifted back to the simple, unburdened existence observed in the livestock, the casual indifference of the pigs rolling in the mud, their contentment visible in every slight shift of weight. You recall that profound simplicity. Everything they required was immediate and physical: root, mud, warmth, and a place to sleep. There was no need for elaborate social performance, no concern with who had better manners or how carefully one needed to execute a daily routine. Their satisfaction seemed inherent, requiring nothing but the simple passage of time. This observation lingers now in the stillness. You find yourself contrasting that unthinking natural rhythm against the subtle complexities of human comportment you have observed throughout this day. The careful greeting, the measured pace, the necessary performance of a community life. To be human is to accrue details, history, manners, expectations. The pig merely is. You continue your slow passage, passing by the outbuildings that flank the main road. These sheds and barns have been emptied for the day. They appear dark, their heavy wooden doors casting deep pools of shadow against the cool, damp stone of the walls. You reach out a hand, noting the rough, uneven texture of the wood grain, feeling the faint grit embedded in it. The structure feels solid, dependable, a monument to continuous habitation. A gentle sound catches your attention now. The distant drip, drip, drip of water falling from an overhanging trough or gutter, perhaps inside a house beyond the reach of your direct view. This small, measured noise becomes unexpectedly prominent in the vast silence, creating a perfect metronome for deep thought. You let its rhythm settle into your chest, matching your own slowing heart rate to its gentle cadence. You realize that sleep itself is a slow, rhythmic process. It requires the deliberate cessation of detailed observation and the acceptance of fading sensory input. The cool air now feels like it has entered your very bones, settling deep into the joints and musculature, inviting relaxation. Every muscle fiber seems to recall the pattern of daily labor, the bending, the lifting, the steady use of hands, and quietly signals its need for rest. Your steps slow further. You are no longer moving with purpose toward a destination, but simply allowing your feet to guide you through the residual quietude of the settlement. The smells grow fainter. The immediate damp wood smoke fades, replaced by the cleaner, colder scent of deep night. It is the smell of settling, of matter slowing down. You walk back towards the periphery of your own home. The structure seems to absorb the dwindling ambient light, its solid walls feeling like a protective shell against the vast, silent immensity outside. You notice the details that only appear when everything else has quieted. A tiny chip in the corner of a window frame, the faint discoloration on the stone threshold where countless feet have walked over generations. The weight of the day's observations finally settles into your limbs. The careful consideration of manners, of utility, of the pig's simple rolling pleasure, all these mental accumulations begin to feel heavy, demanding an end. You pause near your own dwelling entrance and simply lean against the jamb for a moment, letting the cool stone support you. The slow descent into sleep is less a dramatic drop than a gradual softening, like ink dissolving slowly in still water. The edges of reality blur. The smells become indistinct, merging with the cool air. The sound of your own breath begins to dominate the quiet, steady and shallow, becoming the most important element of existence right now. The memories of the day, the flour dust on your sleeve, the scent of wet earth near the market, the deep calm observed in the nighttime sky, begin not to fade away, but simply to settle into a generalized background warmth. You are beginning to match the rhythm of that distant dripping water. One breath out, 2 counts. Another breath out, 2 counts. The need for careful observation recedes completely, replaced by an overwhelming pull towards stillness and deep rest, leaving you suspended.